So John Henry's career, I think, was divided into many sections, but the two most significant were his portraits and his imaginary genre scenes, which are composed using the interiors and the exteriors of Kellie. So today I'm just going to look at the latter set and explore the idea that Kellie was quite literally John Henry's port in a storm. These thoughts I'm presenting are a work in progress, so I am kind of wanting some feedback from people who know a lot more about the Lorimer family and things than I do. So any suggestions or comments at the end would be gratefully received. In 1889, a Parisian art critic wrote, quote, "I should be inclined to say that Mr. Lorimer belongs to the first category of painters, and that his art is undoubtedly influenced by his surroundings." The writer goes on to suggest that because Lorimer was born in, quote, romantic Edinburgh and living for many years in an exquisitely tasteful and delightfully empty old Scotch castle, his eye seems to have acquired from childhood the sentiment of artistic proportion and harmonious colouring that gives him the ability to capture light, especially twilight, when the atmosphere softens and details diminish. So I'm not going to stop here to explore the stereotypes of a romantic Edinburgh, or that a castle is delightful because it's empty, because that's another talk entirely. For our purposes today, this quote's useful for its mention of the Scotch castle, which of course is Kellie, a Fife property that John Henry's parents had leased just over 10 years before this journal article was written. In 1878, John Henry was just turning 22 and training as a professional artist in Edinburgh at the RSA. Having already travelled to France, Spain and Portugal the previous year, he would go on to study in Paris in 1882 and secured a studio in London in 1890. But he always returned to Kellie, eventually living here after his mother died in 1916. At the very beginning, in 1878, John Henry was part of the family's effort to restore the castle. It was in the first instance set up as a family retreat, a holiday home. The plaque placed above the door notes that Kellie was a place for honest ease. Almost immediately after the family acquired the lease in 1878, John Henry's industrious mother, Hannah, insisted that a studio was created in the northwest tower for him. It was one of the first projects because the turret roof that you can see here had collapsed and needed immediate attention. It became a mission then to finish it for John Henry's 23rd birthday in August 1879, which was celebrated when the family were at Kellie for their first long summer. The skylight and a large window for hoisting up canvases was added to make the space more conducive to painting. It's notable that John was one of only two Lorimers to actually live at the property for an extended period of time, the other being his nephew Hugh, who lived in the house with his wife Mary, pictured here in the studio, and their 3 children after World War II. Kellie was certainly the place John Henry utilised for rest and recuperation, and from the age of 60, he took over the lease of Kellie and lived there almost exclusively until his death 20 years later. What interests me is how Kellie both created and stymied John Henry's success. As I see it, it was a place that both helped and hindered his career. So I'm not going to go into his portrait career today, as I said, only as much to say that his career rose meteorically in his mid-20s, largely because of his skills as a portraitist. This 1878 portrait of his father, Professor of Law at Edinburgh University, helped unlock commissions that gave John Henry's career traction that carried him through the decades. Now, because he had work, it seems it was really easy for him to denigrate the sort of plodding nature of portrait painting. He preferred instead to work on more imaginative subject matter. He wrote to his sister Hannah in 1884, saying, "I know portrait painters here in London who have large houses and they make considerable incomes covering canvas by the yard, but they have no reputation whatsoever among their brother artists. That is not a good sort of career, I should say." And a few years later, At 30 years old, he mused in his diary, "The only hope for me is when I am free from the genre of portraiture." John Henry saw himself as an academic painter, yet he became increasingly frustrated by the London and Edinburgh academies. He had studied briefly under Carolus Duran in Paris, a painter whose works catered to escapism. Duran's painting mixed poetry and reality. This here, for example, is a painting commemorating his marriage. His work had been praised by critics in the 1860s who were looking for work that went beyond the grand history paintings found in the French salons. 30 years later, in the 1890s, Lorimer and his friends were beginning to lament the young RSA members in Edinburgh, calling them narrow-minded and even more economical in their views than the seniors. Therefore, John Henry, I think, felt he was sandwiched between two generations already by the time he was in his late 30s. And he believed that the only way forward for the Scottish Academy was to raise the profile of academic painters like himself, who believed a good picture was a direct translation of reality with scrupulously defined halftones. That was a very specific thing for him. Ironically, he's calling other people narrow-minded, but I think he was somewhat narrow-minded. The thing that set his imagination free was not to get involved in avant-garde painting. It was rather to retreat to Kellie for some inspiration. This is not at all to denigrate his process or his style, but simply to point out that it was rather a retreat than an advance that he was interested in. Kellie was his touchstone, a place to regroup and refresh his energies, particularly when he wanted to, as his sister said, to burrow and hide away. It seems it was an open secret that John Henry was an introvert. The French art critic in 1889, that I quoted at the beginning of this talk, called Lorimer a quiet, rather shy and unassuming person. Thus, Kellie suited his instinct to retreat, but at the same time, it assured that he was hidden from a wider world that simply advanced without him. While he used Kellie as a shelter from the storms of everyday life, painters involved in groups like the Glasgow Boys or the Colourists were breaking traditions. They were adapting, they were gathering traction with new audiences, and they are the ones written about in the history books because they pushed art into a new language. This doesn't mean that Lorimer wasn't popular though, because he was. He was extremely popular amongst a traditional set, and he had quite a lot of influence. In this painting, John Henry uses his brother Robert's wife, Violet, and their firstborn son, Christopher, as models. It was purchased at the 1905 Royal Academy Private View for £300, which is roughly 10,000 in today's money. It was purchased by a Walter Scott, not our Walter Scott in Scotland, but an industrialist based in Rochdale near Newcastle. Scott became a baronet the following year and wrote to Lorimer in 1907 to tell him that he had presented the work to the Corporation Gallery, now the Rochdale Art Gallery. He wanted to mark the Jubilee anniversary of his own local newspaper. Scott tells Lorimer that Hush is seen as an example of excellence and donated, so, quote, a work of outstanding merit could set the pace and encourage others to donate to the new municipal art gallery. My wife and my family were exceedingly loath to let it go, Scott remarks, and he continues, I was at the private view of the Royal Academy on Friday and was much interested in your two works there, both very well placed. Well, these two paintings were The Flight of the Swallows that we've already seen and Our Lady, Star of the Sea, which actually is currently unlocated. Both of these paintings were hung on the line at the 1907 Academy exhibition and received high praise from a writer from the Athenaeum's review. This writer suggested that Lorimer was one of very few artists whose calm breadth of vision and use of an entirely modern colour scheme can create a work of unfaltering perfection. The critic concluded that Lorimer's paintings were sure to become, quote, a household feature. While Our Lady, Star of the Sea didn't sell, The Flight of the Swallows did, It was purchased by a new Scottish Modern Arts Association for £100 and was one of their first acquisitions. This was a body that was attempting to ensure contemporary Scottish artists were represented in public collections. And as David mentioned, it is still in a public collection at the Edinburgh City Arts Centre. So Lorimer's work was well liked, it was respected, and it was valued as part of a contemporary scene. His handling of paint was modern enough. I would say it calls attention to the canvas, as Impressionists were aiming to do, without flattening the perspective to call too much attention to the canvas. He was impressionistic for the purposes of highlighting the realism of a scene, but not too much to be wild, like the fauves in France that were so admired by colourists like Peplin. So, how did Kellie help John Henry? Well, I principally think it's the light of the east nook, which lay on the plaster ceilings, the wooden shutters and the floors, and created an aura in the place. This aura still exists today when you visit. Rooks and crows chatter in the trees as time literally slows down, and the building's walls reveal a property with layers of history. The interiors were restored by the family in a labour of love, and this, I think, is what really appears on John Henry's canvases. He began using Kellie's windows, doors, ceilings and floors in genre paintings almost as soon as his studio was ready for him in 1879. This painting, called Farewell, was probably the first genre painting he attempted at Kellie, aged just 23. It has been described as a prototype, and I tend to agree. It is a sign of a new light in his work. I just have to say, though, quickly, that this is actually a lithograph of the painting, not the original painting itself. So the black lines that you see here are a lot harsher than they would be in the original work. So if we compare this to Christmas Roses, which was painted just a few years earlier, you can see what I mean. This painting is set in the family's Edinburgh home and features John Henry's sisters, Janet, Alice and Hannah. It is a relatively sombre setting with dark hues and really strong contrasts. When you look at Farewell, based at Kellie, it has a more shifting, luminous light, which is altogether subtler and suits the more fictitious and sentimental tone of the picture. This East Nook light would dominate and define John Henry's genre paintings. The reality of this scene is John Henry posing his younger sister Louise with their family dog, who was called Tone. In 1879, his sister Hannah wrote about it in a letter, describing it as a little pet of a picture. It features Louise weeping at Johnny's bedroom window at Kellie, and Tone licking and trying to comfort her as Mother waves her handkerchief out of Jim's bedroom. Now, Jim was the eldest and was known to the family as the merchant because he began an apprenticeship with a Leith merchant when he was 18. He left in the early 1880s and was living in Australia and Tasmania. Then he moved to South Africa, where sadly he died in 1898, aged just 46. This 1879 farewell is far too early to depict the sadness of losing Jim. Instead, it was probably inspired by the family having to say goodbye to Janet Alice, who had married the previous year and was leaving with her new husband to live in British Guyana, as Charlotte mentioned before. Now, as curator for Kellie Castle, this painting is interesting for what it helps me identify. It looks like, for example, John's bedroom was in the first floor of the southwest tower. You can see a view out the window. This room is now actually used as a gallery for the work of John Henry. I also didn't know that Jim had a bedroom at Kellie, and Jim's bedroom looks like it was in the southeast tower. It looks like the waving hanky is coming from the library on the first floor of the northwest tower. This tower was used for bedrooms, but I knew the library was used by the professor as a study. I didn't know it was used by Jim as a bedroom, potentially. So it's interesting just to see how they used the property in the first years that they had it. As well as this, despite the sentimental and rather idyllic content of this painting, Farewell provides one of the only documented images of the courtyard with its garden before the stables were added by the Lorimers. In 1878, John Henry's father had agreed with the Earl of Mar a 38-year lease at a nominal fee of £25 a year. The garden walls demanded immediate attention as they had crumbled during the 19th century when the castle was left largely unoccupied. This is when the courtyard walls were extended and a stable block was added. John Henry sketched this painting before construction started, so it has value as a documentary piece of evidence of what the castle looked like in the 1870s. Other paintings, like The Flight of the Swallows, do not show the stables, but instead focus only on the south facade. This painting is probably a view from the second floor rather than Farewell's setting on the first. You can see that the roof line is more directly aligned to the eye line of the figures. This second floor room was a bedroom, known now as the Blue Room because of its colour scheme added in the 1950s by Mary Lorimer. Lorimer includes references to the bedroom in this painting, giving us perhaps an inkling of what it might have been like in 1906. If you look closely in the mirror on the right, you can see roller blinds, which may not be very exciting, but it just gives you a sense of what they were using in their interiors. And in the mirror on the left, Lorimer has painted the corner door open with a suggestion of a stairwell, something that is rumoured to be there but remains blocked off today. Looking at John Henry's paintings of Kellie gives me a better insight into the impact the family had on restoring its walls and injecting life into its rooms. In this rather sketchy watercolour dated 1891, it is clear the family had red door curtains to reduce the drafts, which are still present in the drawing room today. Also, that paintings hung where there is a tapestry now, which was added by Hugh and Mary in the 1950s. It shows that the walls were the same pale yellow and the turret stairwells were the same dark red. We do know that the Lorimers added the cupboard seen here in the photo, but I thought that this was done under the professor's care. However, the professor died in 1890, a year before this sketch was done. And this watercolour doesn't indicate the cupboard at all. It looks like there's a tapestry hanging there instead. Finally, he's added a door in the corner where there is none today. And whether this is something that was here, I'm not sure, but I think he's probably just using artistic license. And he does this a fair amount. In this painting, Johanna Herbert, who's Janet Alice's nursemaid, sits on a step rocking John Henry's nephew. This setting is almost certainly not a nursery. It was John Henry's studio, for there is no other room in the house that has the recess that you can see beside the side chamber that Johanna sits in. What makes this wonderful are the furnishings in the painting. The animal skin rug, the glistening floors, the red curtain, the lantern and the painting. All features that must have decorated the interiors and made the house home. They were probably brought into the studio to use as props, or perhaps this scene is made from a compilation of sketches that John Henry completed across the house, like the one that we've just seen. We know that he did both. We know he took things up to the studio, and we know he painted in the studio. So in this painting, which was likely inspired by a gathering at Kellie in 1891 for the christening of the baby that you just saw in the last painting, Louise told her sister in a letter, John's picture of Bambini at tea is fairly underway, and there's a large table permanently in the studio. There's also a letter describing a painting that he did of his mother, Hannah Lorimer, late in her life, that talks about placing her in the studio. And it was so ridiculously cold in the studio that the painting ended up having a fairly grumpy-faced Hannah Lorimer because she was so freezing cold. So while it is clear that he painted in the studio, he also sketched across the house. This picture is set in the dining room at Kellie, where the 18th century panel paintings are accurately copied, but he adds shutters in the painting, which are found in the drawing room next door, but were probably never in this room because they have obscured the painted panels in the window recesses. The painting has also accentuated the depth and detail on the overdoor lintel, but most strikingly has added a highly decorative ceiling not found in this room. He wrote to his sister on the 8th of March, 1893, telling her that he'd added a new ceiling into his painting of the birthday party, which I fancy, he writes, will look better when it gets framed. The ceiling, of course, sorry, this is a really bad photograph. The ceiling is the elaborately plastered ceiling from the vine room above. And this had to be extensively repaired when the Lorimers took on the lease of Kellie. Years of neglect had left this early 17th century plasterwork unsafe. The north side and the wreath around the ceiling panel had to be taken down bit by bit, copied and reapplied. So John Henry would have been very familiar with it. It's worth noting, by the way, that that panel painting you can see in the photograph wasn't at Kellie in 1893. It was discovered in Ireland in 1916, where it had been taken by the daughter of the 11th Earl nearly 90 years before. Another painting, which is from the Kirkcaldy Art Gallery, it shows how John Henry composed scenes of domesticity by mixing and matching Kellie's fixtures and fittings. Spring Moonlight is seemingly set in Kellie's drawing room. In the painting, there is a panel painting over the door, very similar to those from the dining room. He's also added a second window. He's widened the room. He's changed the direction of the floorboards, perhaps to help with linear perspective in his composition. Plus, the painting includes a ceiling copy from the bedroom above, known now as the Earl's Room. He also used the Earl's Room in this painting, started the same year in 1897. The birthday party faces west. The photograph, by the way, faces east. The painting accurately depicts the door into the stairwell of the southwest tower, but omits the wall, which actually separates the Earl's Room from the west-facing window. For the sake of his composition, John Henry ignores the dressing room altogether and creates a large room for his party, which really just doesn't exist. In this way, he augments reality, using Kellie artistically to respond to the light, laughter, and music that accompanied his sister's visits. John Henry's oil paintings of Kellie span roughly 40 years, from 1879 to 1917, after which his nieces and nephews were grown, his mother had died, and he went on to spend most of his time producing watercolours that are largely devoid of activity and more contemplative, quieter studies of the landscape and the building. They are a response, I think, to the quietened rooms. It is in this period that he becomes a member of the Royal Society of Watercolourists, and his professional standing in the art world fades. There is no doubt in my mind that John Henry Lorimer was an artist of great skill, as this painting of his sister and nephew attests. It was sketched at Kellie in the days the family were gathered for the professor's funeral. This painting is a perfect illustration of John Henry's style, which was largely influenced by realist painters like Jean Millet and society portraitists like the American Singer Sargent. As I mentioned earlier, John Henry's preference was not to draw attention to the paint and overwork the surface of the canvas, as the avant-garde French Impressionists were starting to do, but instead to focus on a subtler handling of paint, to create a beautiful picture that didn't mimic reality, but augmented it. So this is, I think, a subjective realism rather than an objective study. And I think John Henry's desire or default mode towards a subjective perception of reality is Kellie's particular influence. Kellie seems to have enveloped John Henry. No matter where he went, he came back for both comfort and content. It's ironic that the place that provided him with so much inspiration also, I think, restricted his development, not allowing him to advance, but inviting him instead to retreat. The article I quoted at the start said John Henry was a painter that fit into the theory espoused by a French historian, Hippolyte Taine, who believed that a work of literature or art is the product of the author's environment. Now, I believe this absolutely to be true in the case of John Henry, so it's absolutely vital to see his work in terms of his apprenticeship days in Paris, his times in London, and his time pursuing academy exhibitions. But it is also crucial to study his time at Kellie and the influence of Kellie, because that will yield a fully rounded understanding of the trajectory of his painting, but also explain why he has been largely written out of the art history books. Thank you.